Hello and welcome to Mendoza Dialogues, a new program designed to bring together Mendoza faculty and alumni to talk about relevant business issues of the day. We're coming to you today from the Steyer Center for Executive Education, Mendoza's beautiful state-of-the-art facility for delivering degree and non-degree executive programs. I'm Peter Ashley, the Director of Marketing for Mendoza, and I'm pleased to serve as facilitator for today's discussion on the global economy. Before I introduce our guests, a word about the format today. I will pose questions to our guests. They'll answer them as much as they'd like, and I'll ask follow-up questions or move on to a new topic as time allows. And one final note, any views expressed today are purely opinion and are not representative of any official Notre Dame or Mendoza point of view. Now to introduce our guests. With me in Steyer is Professor Jeff Bergstrand. He is the Associate Dean for Graduate Business Programs at Mendoza and a Professor of Finance. Jeff is also a concurrent professor of economics in Notre Dame's College of Arts and Letters, and, if that's not enough, a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. After earning his PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Jeff worked as an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston from '81 to '86, leaving there to join the faculty of Notre Dame. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
Also joining us from New York is Sean King, a 1999 graduate of the Mendoza MBA program, who earned his undergraduate degree from the American University, majoring in international relations. Sean currently serves as Senior Vice President at Park Strategies, a business advisory firm managed by former U.S. Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York. Sean handles the firm's Asia business and is often interviewed about the region. Thanks, Sean, for participating.
Great to be here.
Well, let's begin. I realize that covering the global economy in 20 minutes is quite a challenge, so I will ask this first question. It's pretty open-ended, and I'll direct this first to you, Jeff. We hear a lot about the Federal Reserve potentially raising interest rates. We see the Eurozone slipping back potentially into recession, and Japan recently announcing its falling GDP. What does all this mean, and where do you think we're headed?
Okay. Well, it's obviously a big question, and the world economy is enormous. So maybe to keep track of things, I'll talk first a little bit about the Eurozone and the U.S. economy, and maybe a little bit about Japan. There's an important thing to note, which is that the Eurozone economy is in much more depressed state than we are. Unemployment is 11%. It's been that way for years. A lot of that has to do with structural differences. The U.S. by comparison is doing much better with our unemployment rate below 6% right now. And one of the things that I think, we all know that all these economies, the entire world economy, suffered through the Great Recession and rebounded back. One of the reasons they rebounded back is because the policy tools, there was a coordinated policy change by all these governments, fiscal stimulus, both with increased government spending and tax cuts, monetary stimulus. All the economies around the world pursued that. But that only got us so far. That was really, most of that was in 2009, 2010. Today, the Eurozone, because they face different policy structures, under their Stability Pact, they are very constrained in terms of the role of government and running any kind of budget deficits, and that's hampered some of their further growth back. Also, monetary policy was much more limited. They're actually changing the structure of their monetary policy system as we speak over the last couple of years because the Stability Pact, the Eurozone, is really created to fight inflation, not depressed economic activity. The U.S. by comparison, we're doing a lot better. We're still far from over. We still have some significant cyclical unemployment. But one of the big differences I see between the two economies is that one, in terms of in the rebound, we didn't nearly have as much fiscal contraction in recent years as the Eurozone has had to endure. And we were much more active and much stronger in terms of our monetary stimulus. But where we are today is in terms of there's not much room to use any of those policies. We have zero interest rates right now, and that's the main tool of monetary policy. You can't push further than that. And fiscal policy is somewhat constrained by what's going on politically. And we just had recent elections, and those recent elections kind of suggest that there's not going to be much change on the horizon.
All right, thanks. Sean, anything you want to add to that?
Well, just on the Eurozone, Europe has been stagnant for years, almost dead really. But I think it's important to point out that despite fears, the Eurozone, the euro currency is not going to break up, mostly because Germany needs it too much economically, but also politically. And one interesting thing to look out for is how the sanctions on Russia affected $700 billion of debt to European banks. And if they default on that, if that could provoke some kind of European banking crisis. I agree with Jeff. U.S. is better off. It's less regulated. Has recovered better. Also, the energy revolution here in the United States has made energy cheaper. Meanwhile, Europe relies on Russia for a lot of its gas and oil. Japan, very disappointing. Prime Minister Abe came into office in December 2012 with such hope and fanfare, and his cheap yen and public works projects have just not done it. He and Japan have shown an unwillingness to make the tough decisions they need to reform Japan's economy on things like free trade, immigration reform, which would get more women into the workforce, and the sales tax that they inherited from the previous government that he put into place. It seemed to be too soon before inflation got back up, and it's really hurt spending, it's hurt consumption. They just went back into recession, and he's called a snap election on December 14th to justify delaying a second income tax, which may hurt the economy further. Also, the cheap yen has made imports much more expensive for Japanese, including energy, where Japan's really hurting because no more nuclear power after the Fukushima disaster in 2011. China is slowing down. It's certainly not crashing. I think anybody would take 5 or 6% economic growth year on year, but we see China now drifting into two economies, a developing and a developed. And their developing economy is going to basically go the way of developed markets because they service those markets. So as we slow down, they slow down. So all in all, a mixed bag, some growth, but nothing great.
Thanks, Sean. A quick follow-up on that. You mentioned the issues going on in China. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on how the recent Hong Kong protests might affect what's going on in China and then, of course, the global economy.
In China as a whole, not much, although I think about, and that is that it intends to continually economically reform without political reform, and that may give people long-term pause for China. In terms of Hong Kong's economy separate from the mainland, I think the larger economy, it won't affect much because Hong Kong thought it would be a entrepot into China. It's really become a way out for Chinese money to enter the outside world. Small businesses in Hong Kong near the protests are suffering, but big businesses aren't. And one thing to look out for is that the three financial centers of Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, are always competing with each other for foreign investment. Tokyo is by far the largest, but it's too insular and too Japanese. So for regional headquarters, it's usually Singapore versus Hong Kong. I think in 5 to 10 years, as companies' leases come up and they decide where to put their headquarters, I think more and more people, based on what happened in Hong Kong the last few months, are going to choose Singapore. So I think long-term, Singapore economically benefits from what's happened in Hong Kong.
Great, thanks. Bringing it back to the U.S. for a moment, Jeff, you touched on this, but I wanted to follow up a little bit. The midterm elections were held recently, and the Republicans gained pretty much across the board, picking up governorships and expanding their House majority and even getting control of the Senate. I wonder, as President Obama finishes out his last 2 years in office, how that change in control may affect the U.S. economy and the global economy.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to look at. One is just short term. One thing we note as a result of the election, that while the Senate went in terms of majority to the Republican Party, still they have below the 60 votes. And so it's kind of like the reverse situation of what we've had for the last 2 years is it's very hard to get anything done because of that rule in terms of the Senate needing 60 votes in order to clear hurdles in terms of lawmaking. So short term, I really don't see much change. I think what that means for the U.S. economy is, again, not much role for fiscal policy. We're moving into a world for the foreseeable future where the role of government spending and tax policy is kind of neutralized in terms of how we approach things, and it very much relies on monetary policy. And this is being echoed, as we talk about the world economy. Similar situation in terms of Europe, similar situation in terms of Japan. So we're kind of hamstrung in terms of the short run by that. Long term, I do have a long term concern if this is kind of the foreseeable future, And the long-term concern is that we're not, the role of government is being limited, and the need for basic government infrastructure. Government spending on roads, highways, education, these are all things that I see complement and make profitable the private sector. The strongest economies in the world, the ones with the highest standards of living, are ones that both have a strong private sector but also have a strong public sector. Now granted, that can be over-regulated and things like that. We don't want to go down that route. But I think in terms of long-term being able to pass certain bills, we talk about recently what's going on in immigration. I mean, it's going to be very limited in terms of structural changes that we can do. So I have a bit of a pessimism about that for our long-term future, and that could hurt our standard of living, our growth. And as we look out there today, our growth, if we put aside China and India, which are developing economies and always developing economies grow at a faster rate, among the most mature economies that tend to grow maybe 2-3% per year, the U.S. is the strongest. But that could be impaired by not having a government that's working well to provide those fundamental expenditures like education expenditures, R&D expenditures in infrastructure.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Sean, I wanted to know if you wanted to comment on the potential effect of the elections on the global economy.
Yeah, well, short-term specifics. I think Republican majorities in both houses means that President Obama will not get an increase in the minimum wage. You're going to find Republicans trying to chip away at elements of his affordable health care device on medical tax on medical devices. Also, Republicans will continue to push Obama on the Keystone Pipeline and taxes, although Obama will veto those things. I'm also concerned Republicans may try to play with fire as it regards the debt ceiling and a U.S. default when that's up again, and that could roil markets and hurt confidence in the economy. And keep in mind that we are entering the presidential silly season, and I can think of at least 3 senators who are considering running for office. So anything that has the lens of presidential politics. And one very positive element of Republicans taking the Senate is that they are much more likely than Democrats were to grant President Obama trade promotion authority or fast track on negotiating trade deals for an up or down vote without amendments or death by 1,000 cuts, which I think makes it much more likely that President Obama can bring to a vote and negotiate with our partners from a position of strength the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be the multi-nation free trade deal with our partners in Latin America, North America, and the Pacific.
Great. Thanks for that. Jeff, anything else you wanted to follow up on that topic?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a word. I agree with what Sean said. In terms of these trade partnerships, these are very important trade pacts that we need to pass, both the Transatlantic Pact. There was a recent article about the European Union in terms of their side trying to open up more, make more transparent these negotiations. We don't hear as much about it. It's very important to have that fast-track authority to get the Transatlantic Pact through, and then at the same time we're trying to have a Trans-Pacific Pact as well. And these are very important for drawing us together. It's one thing to keep in mind. In some recent data, if we look at the countries that have pursued, because of somewhat stagnant growth, more restrictive policies, and these can be hidden in terms of how they restrict imports and exports, is China, Japan, Indonesia, some of the largest countries in the world. And so it's very important for us to have policies and for government, basically Congress and the President, to work together to pass these 2 pacts, because when you're trading with partners around the world, that provides a very open, very productive environment for potential growth. And it's a fight against that kind of protectionism, which we know from the Great Depression accelerated a recession back in the 1930s into a Great Depression.
Thanks. Sean, did you have any other additional thoughts that you wanted to share based on Jeff's response?
Just to say that I think for the administration, because of the political, security, and foreign policy concerns, that Trans-Pacific Partnership is considered more imperative than transatlantic. And Obama only has 2 years left and a lot of things going on. already he's, you could say, provoking Congress on the climate change deal with China and his immigration policy. So he's only got 2 years. Goodwill is at a premium. So if one's going to go over the other, I'd say it'd be Pacific, but hopefully he can get both.
Thanks. I'd like to talk a little bit about some inconsistencies that seem to affect the U.S. economy. For some people, the stock market is extremely high, at an all-time high, yet unemployment is also low, but long-term unemployment seems to not be going anywhere, and wages are certainly flat or down. How do all these inconsistencies reconcile? Because they seem sometimes pretty dramatic.
Right. Well, there's actually, if you look at the data and track the U.S. economy, what we feel is one of the remarkable things, remarkable differences about the recovery since 2009, this last 5 years, is kind of the sluggish growth. It's not been a very rapid response, except early on, first couple of years, 2009, 2010. But you're absolutely right, Peter. Wage growth has been stagnant. And this is frustration. I think what we see in terms of the polls, what we see in terms of the midterm elections, is partly frustration by the average family, the median family, in terms of growth. Basically, the facts are this, and will help to reconcile, in my view, what's going on in terms of the strength of the stock market is basically wages have been growing, meaning incomes. The average family's income has been growing about 2% a year for the last 5 years. On the other hand, prices have been rising close to 2% a year. The most recent data just the last year, growth in real incomes was 0.4%. Okay, this has been very standard for the last several years, just very slight gains in terms of standard of living growth for the typical family. On the other hand, productivity growth has been on its long-term average. So it's been 1.5% to 2% a year, and that's basically the story. Real incomes and real wages that corporations are paying are held down, and they're basically held down because we've had very high unemployment. So that high unemployment has kept real wage growth very low, close to zero. On the other hand, firms are benefiting from productivity growth. So the difference there, that's profits. And just a factor is if you look at the corporate profits as a share of GDP, and we want that strong, we want corporations to prosper, it is at an all-time high. It's at a high, it's about 12.5%. Hasn't been that high since 1950. And so basically when you see that the stock market has been very well, it's basically reflecting corporate profits. Corporate profits have been very strong. But it's at a time where real wage growth has been stagnant, not keeping up with productivity growth. And that's my view on that.
Thanks. Sean, any thoughts on that question?
I think over the years, as technology has become more useful for companies and also offshoring, commonly referred to as outsourcing, companies have learned to do more with less. And certainly they had to get by with fewer employees during the Great Recession. And they didn't necessarily want to hire those people back because through technology and other means, they were able to survive without them. And, you know, stock prices go up when you fire people and keep your production the same. So there's a perverse incentive not to hire people because these share prices are so high. And also with the housing crisis in the country outside the major urban areas, housing hasn't really recovered. So there's fewer options for people to put their money. So U.S. equities have become, relatively speaking, very attractive, especially with low interest rates and so many currencies devalued. You can't invest in play currencies anymore. There's less of a housing investment here and around the world. So U.S. equities become very attractive. We're not at full employment. It gives employers a lot of leverage against employees. They prefer to hire on a temp basis. And I hear from clients of ours, they haven't necessarily yet seen the negative effects, but on something like national health care, they want to see how it shakes out in the next year or two before they start hiring more full-time employees. So all those things I think have contributed to, for not the first time in our history, Wall Street being out of sync with Main Street.
Right, thanks. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how sustainable you think that model is, that the inconsistencies that we're experiencing now, how sustainable is that?
You know, I would defer to Jeff on this, but I don't think it's sustainable over the long term because, you know, with cheap money out there and stimulus from the government, you can only buy back shares and pay dividends for so long. Sooner or later, you're going to have to reinvest, grow, and hire people, because then they won't have the money to buy the products you're selling in the first place. So I can't give a specific time frame on it, but sooner or later, this inconsistency will have to be addressed.
Any thoughts? He deferred to you.
I do. I appreciate what Sean said. I fully agree with the two things that he mentioned. One is that the fact that, as we went to a recession, firms cut costs. I mean, this is, in a recession, firms do use the opportunity to improve efficiency. That's how they get their costs down, and in a deflationary, disinflationary environment to stabilize things. So that's a normal response. We're now, in a growing economy, or somewhat growing economy, so they're restoring things. It's absolutely the case that by keeping interest rates low, one of the channels that the Federal Reserve in the United States likes to see as the primary one to lower interest rates is stimulate demand for housing. But they also know a side channel is that it does make the interest rates low, savings in banks low, and stimulates the stock market. So it is a channel. In terms of overall sustainability, that financial channel is not a strong, real channel. It's a financial channel. Now that said, would I argue right now that we're at an all-time high in terms of the S&P? Are we in some kind of bubble? No. I think those stock prices, like I said, reflect largely strong corporate profits and the good stance of corporations, though they're holding a lot of cash. But investment has picked up. But the main channel where it's not sustainable is I think the following. Something that going forward is, we have our alumni for the next several years, decades, is that we're relying on a policy, these interest rates, where we when we had in 2007, we had inflation picking up, so we raised interest rates, we caused a fall in demand, we caused a recession. Now, how do we turn that around? Well, we get interest rates zero, and we hope people buy houses. Actually, they have in the United States. I mean, housing prices for the last several years have been rising 10%. I see that as just classic response of the economy in terms of lower interest rates. You look on the roads, all those new SUVs. You look at the housing market, housing prices are going up. I think that's real. But it also does, the risk we face with these kind of policies is the creation of a bubble. And we know that back in 2005, 6, 7, we did have a housing bubble going on. And I think we will be seeing that again. And so what we see down the road is the economy is getting closer to full employment. The Fed, we know, sometime next year, and we'll see what Sean thinks on this too, I'd be curious to hear, is going to be raising interest rates. They've already removed the quantitative easing. Hasn't had a major impact yet, but it's different when they start raising interest rates. So what I see down the road in terms of maybe forecasting a little bit is this economy has about 2-3 years left. We'll see how fast unemployment comes down. Then they'll eventually start raising interest rates. And we could have a close to a scenario very close to what we saw in 2007, 2008, 2009.
Sean, any thoughts?
Just on interest rates, I know the Fed's considering it. They're keeping their eye on it. I think they're going to look to see how the market's doing and how the economy's growing. One concern about raising interest rates is that the dollar has been gaining strength, especially as Japan devalues the yen. I think it's recently been at 117 to the dollar, where 2 years ago it was only 72. And this, comparatively speaking, especially say in terms of the automobile industry, puts American exporters at a disadvantage. So I don't know if the Fed would want to compound that by raising interest rates. And looking at the lesson of Japan with the sales tax increase, I don't think they want to raise interest rates until inflation's at a healthy enough level where it's not going to eat into economic growth and consumer spending. So, it's more an art than a science, and those are some of the things I would look at as to if and when the Fed's going to do it.
Thanks, Sean. I want to shift gears a little bit. Keynesian economics is enjoying a bit of a resurgence, according to a recent Bloomberg Businessweek article. And I was wondering, Jeff, if you could opine a little bit what that philosophy basically is for those of us who may not know, and why is it enjoying a resurgence now, and what does that mean?
Okay. Yeah, I read the article. I thought it was an intriguing article. I'll cast in terms of 2 points. First of all, at the trough of the recession, I alluded to this earlier, we had a huge fiscal stimulus. It was a coordinated policy around the world in terms of Eurozone, Japan, China as well, India, the United States. We all had a fiscal stimulus, increase in government spending, cut in taxes at the trough of the recession. That was insurance. That's the way you think about it. Yes, it runs up debt, huge deficits, things of that nature, which now the U.S. federal deficit is only about 2.5% of GDP. So we did run those big deficits, and the idea there as insurance was to simply stimulate demand. If consumers are not purchasing goods because they're wary, if firms are not investing in new plant and equipment because they have excess capacity, you got to have somebody buying goods and services, and so the government came in. So that worked. That was 5 years ago, and the monetary stimulus was accompanying it. A bit of a resurgence now because we're not nearly in the situation that we were 5 years ago, but we kind of have this stagnation. Certainly Eurozone is falling into it, hence some discussion of it to try to do on a smaller scale what's going on. And Japan, Japan has for 25 years now been in this situation. The economy grows a little, they raise taxes, economy recedes. Then they cut taxes, then the economy grows, and then they raise taxes, economy recedes. And it's unbelievable. One thing I'd like to say is, in terms of we think about it, there's a belief that whenever we hear the term Keynesianism, it means just big government. But it's when you think about Keynesian, the original Keynesian thoughts really focused on a couple things, which we didn't know back in the 1930s. They focused on the short run versus long run, and they focused on that demand is important as well as supply. And these are fundamental things, that short run is different than the long run. Demand matters as much as supply, and there's some role for that. So there's kind of the popular, by some accounts, the popular view that Keynesianism necessarily means big government. Doesn't necessarily mean just that. It's a role for fiscal policy as well as monetary policy to bring demand up to a higher level and to kind of meet our potential.
Thanks. Sean, any additional thoughts on Keynesian economics you want to share?
Keynes himself may not have been big government, but I think big government types are more likely to act in his name when it comes to addressing issues. And my view on Keynesian economics is saying that economics in the market is often driven by emotions, and consumption is what really gets an economy going. So when it's in the doldrums, you want to stimulate it to get people feeling better, sort of like Prozac, and then they spend more and the economy becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think it came back in vogue in 08, 09 because what happened, people became disillusioned with the purely Milton Friedman-esque supply-side market, free market economics. But if you listen to someone like Jeffrey Sachs say, we've done too much Keynesian economics and stimulus, and it's let governments and politicians off the hook for making the tough decisions to reform and go forward. So that's why I think it's in vogue, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. It's more of a short-term Band-Aid.
All right, thanks, Sean. And actually, I'll stay with Sean with you on this one. We're about out of time, so I wanted to give you a chance to share any last nuggets of wisdom around the economy for the viewers.
I think 6 months from now, we're basically going to be where we are now. The only market that could really make a big change would be Japan, and that is only because of this election in December we have. And if Prime Minister Abe gets he will get a majority. It's just a question of how much he gets. If he gets suitable enough, then he can perhaps, if he really wants to, follow through with the necessary reforms to help Japan turn the corner. But if not, I think we're going to be where we are today. And the other takeaway is markets don't act in a vacuum. Politics matters, government matters, and you can't have one without the other. So keep an eye on the public sector to see where the private sector might go. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sean, and thanks again for participating. Jeff, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I think fundamentally the U.S. economy is strong. So as we kind of look forward, and I think reasonable forecasts can maybe go out 2 years, and that's in the absence of shocks like the financial crisis and bubbles bursting, things like that. We're actually fundamentally doing well, and much better than the other mature economies. So we have likely solid growth. We've been running about 2% a year for actually several years, and so we'll continue at that. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that population growth in the United States historically been a little over 1%, is now only about 0.7%. So when you hear 2% growth, that's not as low as what it used to be when we had a larger growing labor force. So fundamentally, we're sound. Real wage rates have been going down and helping to clear the labor market. So like below 6% unemployment is quite good. So compared to a big part, with the exception of Germany, a big part of the Eurozone, we're doing much better. We're also doing better than Japan in that regard. And fortunately for the world economy, we have China and India continuing to take off over some important, and to support maybe something Sean would say, liberalizations in terms of their economic policies that have fostered their economic growth, and so that Asia will be the growth center of the world in the coming decades.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, this concludes the first Mendoza Dialogues. We hope you have found the conversation interesting and informative. We look forward to hearing your feedback on the format and potential future topics. In the meantime, thanks and have a great day.